Great, welcome everybody. Just to ensure a couple notes before we start, and we're going to give it another minute or two to allow folks to hop on. I know this is right after dinner for some folks, or you had to sneak away from the family dinner table. So thanks for joining us. Make sure you have a pen and paper with you. And if you are not a panelist, if you could just keep your video off and stay muted so that we can make sure that everybody can see the folks who are speaking. On Zoom, sometimes it can be tough to see if everybody's got their video on. So thanks very much, and looking forward to this discussion tonight, and thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. Thanks. Great, so I think most of us are here. I think we're, is that Tammy joining the YC? No. Tammy, if you're on, can you just show your video? So I know you're here.
I'm trying, it's not.
Oh, okay. Okay, got it. Where, I just don't see your name. Oh, there you are. Okay. I see you. Let me see if I can help. Great.
Thank you.
Magic. Awesome. Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. It looks like folks are coming in, and it's great to see folks writing in the chat. Feel free to use the chat. Make sure you have a pen and paper. And if you're comfortable, if you want to, let us know your name, the age of your children or child, and your neighborhood and location. Oop. And oh, just had my own 2.5-year-old almost run in, but the husband got her. So I am so delighted to be here tonight with all of you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Delegate Brooke Learman, and I represent, with my awesome teammates, Senator Bill Ferguson and Delegates Robin Lewis and Luke Clippinger, the 46th district in Baltimore City. Although, of course, we work at the statewide level to try to pass and implement policies that affect the entire state. You know, it's great to be here tonight to talk about this really important topic. I'm an elected official, but I'm also a parent. And I know there are a lot of parents out there who, you know, we're trying to raise conscientious and kind children, but we can't really stop there at this point. And we know that. We have to be constantly learning and educating ourselves about our own implicit biases, but also acting to make sure we're raising our children to work against the racism that exists in the world in which we're raising them, to be, as Ibram Kendi says, anti-racist. And so I'm really pleased to be able to participate in and listen to this conversation tonight. I think that, you know, if there's one thing that this pandemic has done besides cause so much unnecessary suffering and death, it's also really crystallized the pre-existing inequities that exist in our society and the lack of resiliency in our communities and state government institutions to support families and small businesses and nonprofits. And we've seen that especially in the Black community, and the huge disparities that exist in healthcare access, in outcomes, in businesses. You know, I've held a series of online briefings since coming home from our truncated General Assembly session on topics, on a range of topics, from applying for benefits to supporting our frontline workers and closing the digital divide. And this webinar, I'm excited about it. So it's a new month of briefings that will have discussions about redlining, about public education, higher ed, and on Thursday about Maryland's budget. And I do these because I think it's really important that elected officials, we know that it's about more than just passing legislation. It's about connecting people to the resources that they need, driving discussions about important topics, and advocating for change in multiple ways. And I think this discussion and discussions like it are one of them. So why a webinar on raising anti-racist white children? So I think, as a white woman who's grown up with privilege, and as an elected official, it's my job to speak up about racial injustices in my district and beyond. That means on a personal level, teaching my children about race and racism and anti-racism, supporting my Black friends and family members whenever and however they need me to, and being a strong ally. And, I think all of us approach this differently. I do this work as a human being who cares about our fellow human beings and their worth and dignity of our fellow men and women, but also as an elected representative who has the honor of representing a really diverse district. And also, because I fundamentally believe that our communities can never reach their potential unless all of us are given the opportunity to reach our potential, especially our Black brothers and sisters. So a couple people in the questions asked why this is for white parents and white kids. And I think the answer is that because we're the ones who need to be doing this work. It's really important to acknowledge that families of color are much, much more likely to talk to their children about race and ethnicity than are white families. The Sesame Workshop has some good reporting on this, and they reported that 61% of Black parents, 56% of Asian parents, and 46% of Latino parents say their families discuss race and ethnicity often or sometimes. Just a quarter of white parents say they talk about it with any frequency. I think this is not a conversation of choice for many Black families, but of necessity and survival. And we know that silence about race can reinforce racism by letting children draw their own conclusions. We're often taught if you have nothing to say nothing at all, or if you have nothing nice to say nothing at all. And that's why we need to speak up. When we're allowed to draw our own conclusions, systemic racism can really persist. So I'm excited to be hosting this webinar. I'm thrilled to have these amazing speakers on to talk with us tonight. I'm going to just go through their bios briefly and then turn it over to them. We have a few slides to go through as well that I know will be really helpful, but I'm just, really excited, and thank you to all of you for being here tonight, and thanks to everybody for joining us for this important conversation. So let's start. Beth Drummond Casey. Beth grew up in Western Massachusetts. She attended Smith College, and she's worked for many years at several local K-12 private schools, including Park School, where in the early 2000s, she and a colleague founded the Faculty Professional Development course, broadening the conversation around race. In 2005, she co-founded the Middle Grade Partnership, a nonprofit focused on bringing public and private school students and teachers together through summer and after-school programming. She's raised 3 children in Lauraville, and her husband is an architect, and they live in Bolton Hill, where they are decades-long members of Memorial Episcopal, and Beth is now the executive director of Bolton Hill Nursery, a preschool and child care center. Thank you, Beth. Christina has lived in South Baltimore since 2005. She's currently part of the District 46 Showing Up for Racial Justice leadership team, and she's originally from Minnesota. She lives with her husband and 2 children, ages 9 and 11. Being in an interracial marriage helped motivate her to do more work for racial justice. She's also a Girl Scout troop leader, yoga teacher, member of a local Buddhist group, Baltimore Dharma group, and has worked for nonprofits for decades. Welcome. And Liz Simon Higgs lives in South Baltimore with her spouse and 2 children, ages 8 and 10. She works for Baltimore City and is very active in her synagogue and also in showing up for racial justice. And Tammy. Tammy is a racial equity and social justice advocate based in Baltimore. She's licensed to practice law in Maryland and Washington, D.C., and she works with nonprofit and advocacy groups to weave together anti-racist education, action, and organizational leadership. Tammy believes their personal authenticity and vulnerability are the foundations for equity in education, effective community relationships, and organizational change. I'm thrilled to have all these amazing people here tonight to speak, and I'm gonna turn it over to them. You've heard enough from me, so here we go.
Thank you so much, Brooke. That's really lovely. And thank you for hosting this conversation. It's not an easy one for many of us, and I did grow up in Minnesota, and we do not talk about things like this. So when you first emailed me, I thought, Me? Well, I could maybe tell you all the mistakes that you shouldn't make. So yeah, it's brought me back to the fact that really I'm committed to being here just to show up, even if we don't have all the right answers and we make mistakes. That's part of the learning process. So thank you very much for inviting all of us. We have an amazing panel. Many of you sent in wonderful questions, and I really feel like there's a listening happening at this moment in our society, and I see so many names and faces, and it's very exciting to be part of this. So thank you all for really listening and opening up this space. We're going to jump right in by sharing something kind of vulnerable, sharing a very brief personal story that illustrates maybe a critical moment for each of us, something that helped clarify our commitment to racial justice. And then we're going to sort of unpack that a little bit and give you guys some tips. A lot of folks have asked for specific steps and tips. So my story takes place maybe 5 years ago. My husband, who is from Vietnam, he was a refugee, and he's a person of color. He came home from running some errands in Ellicott City, and he was super upset because somebody had road rage and shouted lots of angry swear words at him and our children who were in the back seat. The words were like, "you slant-eyed," expletive, expletive, lots of expletives. And so it was really upsetting. And these things happen, you know, more than we would all like to admit. But over the next few days, we sort of tried to process it. And what I really want to highlight is not the incident so much as my response to it. I said, honestly, it's so strange. I don't really see you as a person of color. And I had been married to this person of color for like a decade. So I think that I hear that a lot now when I talk to my family and friends about racism, and there's a discomfort with even talking about the fact that we're people of color or we're white. So this is a blind spot. One of my favorite expressions after people talk about being blind to color is, okay, so what do you do at a stoplight? Do you stop or do you go? So we need to see color. And so that's my personal story of not seeing color. And now we're going to hear from Beth. Thank you.
Just unmute Beth. Oh, sorry.
Sorry about that. I'm always worried my clock is going to ring, so I actually turned the clock off. So if we're to raise anti-racist kids, we have to first be honest about the racism that's actually inside each one of us. For this opening section of the webinar, we wanted to pick the right story, each of us, one that would be hard for us to talk about, and also set an example for you about being comfortable with discomfort. You'll hear several of us mention that tonight. My problem was last week, as I reached the weekend, I actually hadn't settled on the story that I wanted or could tell. But then Saturday afternoon, I got a text from a really close friend, literally just 3 days ago. My friend had been alarmed to hear from her 30-something child that the Black alums and students at a few local private schools had started an Instagram thread. And it's a thread that shares personal stories of racism while the students had attended the schools. And yeah, my friend was reaching out to me to let me know that one of the stories on Instagram was about me. I raced to Instagram. The thread had dozens of entries, and there was one featuring Ms. Casey right near the top. So this Instagram post went up in the last couple of days. The story it told happened 26 years ago, but still, reading it, knowing that it was about me, it was hard. I felt ashamed. My brain shifted immediately into defensive mode. But fortunately, preparing for this evening's talk, I was able to draw on some of our recent collective learning, and I called myself out on my defensiveness, because defensiveness is unproductive. If you really are here tonight and going forth after this evening intent on becoming anti-racist, defensiveness is going to prevent you from ever getting there. So crazy as it could sound, I'm actually getting comfortable with the shame that I've felt in the last couple of days, since I know that the power of that feeling actually is what will propel me into positive actions in the future. So I'm going to turn the screen over to Tammy.
Thanks, Beth. I'm going to start my story with a need to know for all of you. My children and most of my nieces and nephews are Black, or what society does consider biracial. When I was asked to share a critical moment on my anti-racism journey, my gut response was to talk about this Baltimore Racial Justice Action, this BRJA event that I attended when my oldest, who's almost 11, was 5. On talking to kids about racism. And then when I contemplated that experience, I thought back and I realized the story really began 10 years or about a decade before that. My now 17-year-old nephew came to me when we were over at the house one day. I had no children yet, and said, "Aunt Tammy, I wish I looked like you." And I knew what he was saying, but I said, "What do you mean?" He said to me, "I wish I was white." And in that moment, I realized I had no real quality response to provide to him, my nephew, who I love with all my heart. And I just sort of fumbled and said something like, "I think that what you are is better. You're sort of like the best of both worlds, and isn't that great?" So yeah, I left that situation sitting there feeling paralysis, like a deer in headlights, a welling of grief that I was heartbroken for my 5-year-old nephew, who had already internalized these ideas from society and from school and wherever, and he had already applied them to himself. And anxiety, asking myself, what can I do? How will I possibly be ready to have this conversation with my own kids when the time comes? And I guess over the decade, those feelings built, and my internal conversation kept happening. And then I had my own children, and I discovered BRJA. And sort of the initial concrete action was this event that I went to on talking to kids about race, because I needed to know how to do it. And so I attended the event. I listened really carefully. I asked a member of BRJA at the end, how can I approach these conversations with my 5-year-old? They're coming anytime. I need to have the language and the skills to do this and do this well. And the advice I got that I'll share with you here, that I have tried to act upon since then in every possible way that I can, is that children will give you opportunities for conversation, either through comments they make or questions they ask, that we, the adults who influence them so greatly in their lives, can use these moments to teach them and dialogue with them. We can let them guide the direction and the length of the conversation, and that depending on their age, it might be a short conversation, it might be long. They will let you know when they've had enough and when they have processed enough, and then you can move on to the next thing. And so I just leave you with a little bit of guidance there that was really instrumental to me as I've continued on my journey. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll turn it to Liz.
Thanks. It's really cool to see folks from so many different places here. We've lived in, my family, my spouse, my 2 kids, and I have lived in South Baltimore for almost 15 years. Not from here originally. And when my kids were about 5 and maybe 2.5, I took them to the Reginald F. Lewis Museum, which is the museum, it's at the corner of Pratt and President Street. It's a big red and black building that's to reflect the colors of the Maryland flag. And I went in with my kids, so I was probably, I was carrying my younger one, and I had my older child, Daniel, who's 5. And we get up to the top floor, which is where the permanent exhibits are. And I turned to Daniel and I said, "This is a museum about the history of Black people in Maryland." And Daniel looks at me and he says, "I don't like Black people." And I asked him, why don't you like Black people? He didn't have much of an answer, but it made me realize I had a lot to do. We live in a neighborhood that's mostly white. He was in a school that was mostly white. People at our synagogue are mostly white. What I had been communicating was white people are our people. And it doesn't matter if I'm nice to other people. He was getting those messages really clearly. And it also occurred to me later as I reflected on this incident, does he even know what I mean when I say Black people? What is he even envisioning? And so it made me recognize both the power of my own choices and the assumptions that adults make, that white people make, that I make, and that we really need to begin to unpack in order to understand what racism is and how deeply it hurts all folks in our society, and especially folks of color. So next slide, please. I would ask you to just take a moment to think about what you've heard. Maybe take a second to jot down your own story or what comes up for you in this moment. So we're just gonna have a minute of quiet to just process, think, write if you need to. And if we could just get the next click, it will not be a new slide. If you would, in the chat, do you identify as white? And feel free to go ahead and write if you have a moment. All right. I appreciate seeing so many people's responses. Next slide, please. Oh, maybe click again. Okay. So I appreciate people being able to identify how we're seen. Part of what we want to do tonight is make visible whiteness, color, assumptions, and power structures for us and our kids. And the reason that we need to make these things visible is because if we don't see them, or we are colorblind and we pretend we don't see them, then we certainly can't dismantle the power structures and the harm that we perpetuate. And as we go through tonight, especially as we finish, I think something that's really important for us to do is identify the next hard thing that we're going to do. Being anti-racist is not easy. In fact, almost everything in society tells us to just fall into line. And so being anti-racist requires like kind of constant resistance, which is always hard. So as we wrap up tonight, as we leave, like what's the next hard thing we're going to do for us and for our families? As we go through the rest of the webinar tonight, here's kind of the guidelines. Beth has already mentioned this. Please live in the discomfort. These are not comfortable conversations. These are not comfortable thoughts. And really getting into some of that like moral and emotional space of discomfort is actually how we grow. Learn why you are here. Each person has a different route into this work. For some people, it may have begun long ago. For some people, it's very recent. For me, having a kid with a disability was a huge window into how oppression works. Everybody comes from a different place. Also, appreciate growth. Becoming anti-racist it's not something you ever arrive at. It's something that you grow towards. And so on the journey, appreciate growth, appreciate making a step forward. And finally, accept non-closure. Again, there's no diploma at the end of this. And so for those of us who like to set goals and attain them, this work is a little bit different. It's one foot in front of the other, and sometimes it's a step back. So these are, as we do work to dismantle racism, I think these are some really good guides to work within. Next slide, please. So I'm gonna talk first about some of the tools that I use for myself and with my family as far as working to dismantle racism. Our history is filled with tons of examples of racism, and so using history as a grounding place is really important. It's also important because it depersonalizes this for us a little bit. Instead of getting stuck in the guilt and the shame that Beth really clearly articulated, we can kind of go to a place of, no, there's a reason we're here. So I just want to talk about one really small example of how racism is so deeply ingrained in our country. So the GI Bill of 1944, this was passed by Congress as many servicemen and women were coming home from fighting in World War II. And it provided returning soldiers low interest housing and business loans, college tuition and living stipend, medical care, and unemployment benefits for 1 year at $20 a week, which back then was a good amount of money. This bill is really widely credited with building so much of America's middle class. But the benefits of it really did not accrue to Black folks at all, because at that time, the Federal Housing Authority legally denied loans to Black people or charged them really high interest rates, so that basically home ownership was all but denied to them, and sometimes, and they were exploited if they were allowed to even get loans. Black veterans were unable to build home equity, which is really one of the primary components of middle class wealth. And I know that I personally benefit from my relatives being able to purchase homes and build equity and then pass that on to the next generation. Also for Black folks, because higher education was still segregated, Black vets had very few options of colleges to attend. And these are things that didn't just have an impact in the moment, but had long-term impact, and also really shaped people. You know, it's not just the legal framework, but also the attitude people have towards feeling superior because we have more. Next slide, please. So the title of this webinar is raising anti-racist kids, and I think it might help to know what anti-racism is. It's a process of actively identifying and working to dismantle racism through change of yourself, of organizations, policies, laws, attitudes, and so on, so that power structures can change and power can be shared equitably. So think about it as identifying and then working to dismantle. Some of my favorite tools that I use for my own learning and with my kids. So my kids are now 8 and 10. I'll show this fourth bullet. I taught them the words racism and sexism starting when they were like 3 or 4 years old. And their understandings are not perfect, and neither are mine. And frequently we still make errors. My favorite quote about this is, there will be lots of bites at the apple. And it's true, like we get it wrong and our kids get it wrong. But if we can't name it, we're really powerless to dismantle the oppressions that exist around us. And there's obviously there are many types of oppression. There's ableism and classism and many others. And I would encourage you to start naming these really explicitly. So some of my favorite tools again are learning history, world history and US history, observing and not judging. So there's a couple of ways that I do this with my kids. I often let their observations guide me. And I also often make observations to them and kind of ask, why do you think that is? So for example, my kids for several years, all of their main classroom teachers were white and the paraprofessionals or assistant teachers were Black. And this is in many city schools. And it's really worth conversing about because kids notice this. Kids are not colorblind. We're not colorblind, and pretending to be so just says, oh, we can pretend oppression doesn't exist. So noticing these things and questioning them and starting to unpack them, this is really critical and powerful because this is the world that our kids live in and the world that we live in. I also try with my kids to ask questions and not make assumptions. Tammy has some great advice about this, some really good questions to ask down the line. I think especially when it comes to looking at media, it's really good to ask, who wrote this story? Who is the story about? Is the person that it's about the person telling it? And why did they choose to frame it the way they did? So these are some tools that I use with my kids. As far as observing, I also try, this is kind of related, if I'm offering praise to them, I don't need it to be a judgment of their character. I can just observe things like, oh, I noticed that you put your laundry in the hamper, or I noticed that you took a long time to work through that problem and you showed all your steps. So these are some tools where we can incorporate, instead of jumping to judgments as so much of US culture and white culture tell us to do, just like sitting back and observing. And our kids are really good at that. They're great at sharing observations with us, and it's on us to listen. As I mentioned, teaching my kids the words sexism and racism has been one of the most powerful tools for us in just opening up discussions. These are words that I've had to get comfortable using, and my kids are very comfortable using them now. Lastly, again, there's this question of comfort, and it's okay to be uncomfortable in these conversations, but please remember that as a white person, especially if you're a white person with class privilege, it is very rare that you are actually unsafe. People of color, especially Black people in this country, their lives are constantly on the line when they walk out of their house, and as we saw with Breonna Taylor, also when they're in their house. So the way that power structures work, white people rarely face that lack of safety, especially when there's just a conversation about racism. And so just remember that comfort is not the same as safety. I'm going to turn this over to Tammy. Next slide for Tammy, please.
So I wanted to just lay out the levels of racism for those of you who haven't maybe encountered them in this way before, and you can think of them as sort of ripples in a pond, concentric circles ever widening. Interpersonal, cultural, institutional, or organizational, and then structural. We get very bogged down, and Liz has mentioned the color blindness theory several times. We get very bogged down in individual acts and looking at people as bad apples, rotten apples, one-off behavioral problems. We see ourselves as individuals being colorblind, that race is not a thing. We get very focused on this level, and we oftentimes don't see the larger ripples coming out from this level of racism. Microaggressions, for example, can I touch your hair, or just touching hair, clutching your purse or your bag when a person of color is close by, crossing the street. These sort of individual behaviors that constitute interpersonal, person-to-person racist acts. Cultural is this idea of stereotypes, and when you're making assumptions about groups, you're essentially devaluing quote unquote minority cultural norms. Then you get to this level of institutional or organizational, which is the policies, procedures, and practices that are instituted that uphold systems of racism and white supremacy. For example, housing regulations, like Liz mentioned earlier, lending practices when you're talking about credit scores and interest rates and that type of thing. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. I'm just giving you some examples here, just in case you haven't really seen these broken out like this before, that you can really start to see and understand that it's all around you. You just really have to look for it. And then structural is the whole shebang, right? It's this idea of whiteness as an invisible norm. We don't even see it. We exercise our privilege in myriad ways that we don't even see and we don't even recognize very often. It's this anti-Blackness embedded in all aspects of society. This, and this can be elucidated by seeing assimilation as a goal. When we want immigrants to come to this country and melt into the pot is actually whiteness, right? We want them to come here and become American, which actually means become part of the white normative structure. And when we argue and we say that race is no longer an issue, that these things were resolved a long time ago, that's ignoring structures all around us that are just the air we breathe everywhere all the time, that we can frankly choose not to see, or that we have never been trained and sort of taught to see as white people. Next slide, please. So a couple of questions here I wanted to propose to you all to think about is how can we think about racism on these different levels? And how can we engage in meaningful dialogue with children about racist behaviors and structures? In my family, we've talked a lot about rulemaking. I'm an attorney, it's kind of comes with the territory. We read a long time ago when the kids were younger, The Case for Loving, which is about Mildred and Richard Loving in Virginia, anti-miscegenation laws. And the case that actually the Supreme Court finally struck down those laws in the lingering states that still had them. I've used the US Constitution as a baseline example, and I talk about who was present: white, heteronormative, property owning, able-bodied Christian men. I mean, I sort of have used that as sort of a starting point because it helps open the door to talking about many levels of oppression in addition to race. We can talk about why they made those rules or why the rules are made today. And we can talk about how the rules are structured and what their impact is. We can go back to the GI Bill, like Liz mentioned, and talk about the lingering effects of that and how it has created our society as it exists today. Words that I use with my children are fear, power, money, control, denial, ignorance. And I really think that these can be used with kids of any age. My kids are 11, 9, almost 7, and I can use these in different ways with all 3 of them, just depending on where they're at in their knowledge and how deep the conversation can go. And I would just urge you, as I do for myself constantly, and I'm just shocked on a daily basis at what I don't know that I thought I knew, to dig deep. Always question your assumptions and what you think you know, what you've been taught, what you thought was the truth, and just really question it and drill down to make sure you really understand where that comes from and how harmful it is. Next slide, and thank you.
You're muted, Beth.
Oh, Beth, you're muted.
I am also the resident geezer on this webinar. Sorry about that.
You're doing great.
I've been an educator for more than 4 decades in Baltimore. Most of my career, I've taught elementary, middle school kids. But the job I have right now, I focus mostly on preschool, and I actually see it as an interesting stage to focus on at sort of a capstone era in my career. And I want to make sure we focus in on issues related to early childhood in this conversation, because as we scrutinized the questions all of you submitted, and thank you so much for the breadth and depth of all those questions, it was clear there are a number of people on this call tonight who are really struggling with how do I start this? When is it too early? How do I not overburden my child? How do I not oversimplify? I thought it was very interesting. We had a concern for oversimplification very nearby in the question document for overburdening. So I think I'm gonna sit here as, I don't know if I'm an expert, but I have learned a few things over the years, and I just wanna make sure it's really clear to you that it is never too early to speak and listen to your child with an anti-racist perspective. You need to know that from the time a child is in utero, that child is listening to you. That child grows comprehension of what you're saying over the first year to 18 months of his life. And those of you who are parents of 2 or 3-year-olds are experiencing the verbal explosion of the 2 to 3-year-old who's just suddenly talking about everything. And by the time they're hitting 4 or 5, they are actually bringing stuff back in, asking you questions. This is all normal. For us to be silent about the kinds of topics that we've been referring to tonight is also making a strong statement to the children. And so I think it's really, really important for you to understand that it's never too early to start. Someone wrote in wondering about the phrase, my child said to me, I don't want to be white. Tammy referred to something like this earlier in the conversation. Well, honestly, you hear a statement like that from your child, and that would not be a 1 to 2-year-old. That would be a pretty amazing 1 to 2-year-old who said something like that, but it very much could come out from a child who is 4 or older. Don't shut down. You need to, what I put here was encourage your child. That means let that child know that just because they may have said something to you that you've never heard before and you're a little scared to handle, you need to give them an answer. And it does not have to be it doesn't have to be profound, or let me say profound in the sense that perhaps your high school English teacher would have called it profound. You don't want to be white? Tell me more. And I hope you'll walk away from this webinar tonight with tell me more. I have gotten so much mileage out of that, just that simple phrase, repeat what they said, tell me more. Because you actually don't even know the context in which they may have said to you, I don't want to be white. So give them an answer. Don't forget to pause. I think parents of all age groups are far too inclined to talk as opposed to listen, and just take your time and ask another question. Could we have the next slide, please? This is a poster that we'll include in the resources that we send out after this evening. We're not going to go over it too much, but just to drive home my point, children are never too young to talk about race. I'd love for you to zero right in on the 5-year-old over towards the right hand of the continuum, that by kindergarten, children already have learned to associate some groups with higher status than others. And they're absolutely aware in ways that you actually have no idea. I think another interesting research study is the one referenced on the far right, which is having an explicit conversation about race with your 5 to 7-year-old can dramatically improve a child's racial attitudes for the rest of his or her life. So just don't forget that. Could we have the next slide, please? So in general, we'll be sending out this resource, 10 tips for teaching and talking about race with your children. It's actually, of all the resources I've reviewed for tonight, this 2-pager is one of the strongest. Make sure, as we've mentioned already, watch your own behavior, because children learn what they live and what they see and what they hear. So who's in your friendship circle? Your kids are noticing that. How does your family spend its free time? Your kids are paying attention. Give that some thought. Be honest, as Liz was referring to earlier. Bigotry and oppression are real. And you see it, talk about it. Don't shy away. Your family can help end them both. And I see that as sort of an incredibly empowering message that you can give to your children. And at the end of the day, you can't be a bystander. I think when I look back on my track record as a parent, one of the things I regret the most is not having been more of an activist to role model for my children. Somehow they've turned out okay, but even so, it's our job to be a change agent, and to really help them understand that they can do it too. Final point on this slide is, do not be afraid to mess up or to stumble. When that happens, take advantage of it and own it. Next slide, please. This on the left is the actual Instagram post. We won't spend really any time on it. I'm including it here mostly to make the other point. The story that showed up on Instagram happened in 1993, and it had to do with children being tracked according to, well, again, children being tracked according to their race from a young person's perspective. And yet look at the question that showed up on the right in the question document we reviewed for tonight. The reading groups at our school largely correlate with race. What can we do about this as parents? I'm actually sorry that both of these truths are the truth. And so I thought my last point, next slide, please. I would just, since there were quite a few questions from all of you about dealing with your kids' school, I feel powerless. What am I supposed to do? How can we bring this anti-racist lens to the school? I I was a principal for quite a few years, a principal or an assistant principal. So I'm probably going to have that hat on while I'm talking to you on this slide. But please scope out the layers of power and figure out who the decision makers are, and don't consider yourself as being powerless. Whether you're going to reach out and link yourself with other parents, whether you are going to approach your child's teacher, your child's principal, or even the bureaucrats at North Avenue who make decisions about the curriculum you may or may not like that's coming home in your child's class. You have the power to do something. So it's on you to figure out where is the layer of power that you can most effectively leverage yourself. And, you know, I got this second bullet from one of my colleagues on the webinar tonight, and it's not something I would ever have said, but honestly, I love saying this to you. Leverage your power as a white person when you can, especially if it is going to push an institution towards anti-racism. I guess the other thing I want to offer, since I think there are lots of parents on this call, is to be wary of becoming an adversary. I think you'd be surprised when you're talking to your child's principal how much principals are looking for partners, even if that partner is bringing disagreement and criticism to the principal. If you truly come with an affective partnership, you may be surprised what you can actually achieve in your own child's school. And I guess my final point is be comfortable speaking up, but also know when it is time to be silent. And I do think that that's one of the strongest messages that I know I have to go through my life with, and it probably is the aspect of whiteness that I wear most comfortably, is the comfort level I have with speaking up. And just remember that there's time to speak up and there's time not to. And I'm going to pass it over to Christina.
It's me, actually.
Sorry. Oh, to Liz. I beg your pardon. Sorry, I'm passing it over to Liz.
Just one quick note, and I, you know, as a parent and as a former teacher myself, I think having partnership with other parents is huge. And I would just say, you know, we do have unique power as white people, and we need to wield it very, very carefully. Right? Any of us who saw the incidents of like Amy Cooper calling the cops on a black bird watcher know that white people have a lot of power. We do need to use it to speak up against injustice, and we also need to be accountable to people of color. This is something that I really appreciate about both BRJA and Surge showing up for racial justice is while people of color are by no means monolithic, right? Black people are not monolithic. There's no Black opinion, but there is Black leadership. There's phenomenal Black leadership, and it's on us to follow. I just want to, this picture that you see was just a screenshot from my phone of the Baltimore Sun on Sunday morning, May 31st. So this was as all of the protests were really beginning across the country around the killing of George Floyd. And I want you to look at like the cheerful white lady and the headline, which is "Stores Vandalized, Fire Set in Bank, Baltimore Police Pelted as Hundreds Protest George Floyd Death." And I want you to just think about, and this is really something that you can do with your kids, especially older kids, really kids ages like 8 to 80, right? You can talk about who is telling this story? Why are they telling it in this way? Who is the story about? And something I wonder is like, and I do this with my kids, like, do you think this is the whole story? What, like, you've been with me at the protests, what have you noticed? Who chose the images to go along with this? What do the images convey? How does it make you feel looking at them? And, you know, obviously these particular questions might be phrased in such a way that's more appropriate to talk about with a 10 or 12-year-old, but there's so many rich conversation starters to have with kids really of any age. One of my kids and I have been in the car a fair amount lately, and sometimes we listen to Democracy Now!, which is a program I really enjoy listening to with them because it often has an anti-racist framework. And so, you know, we frequently miss half the show because like we hear 2 lines and we turn it off and talk about it. So just some other ideas for, you know, how do we directly engage our kids with this work, not just walk away with, you know, some platitudes. This is just one example, and I really, I encourage all parents to have a really critical eye around all the media that comes into your home. Tammy talked about cultural racism, and that just is permeating throughout all media. And so the more of a critical analysis that you and your family can develop, the better off we all are, because then we can kind of see through what's actually going on, which is not easy, but it's like the only way forward. So now I am going to hand it back to Christina, and thank you.
Thanks. Next slide. Yeah, that's great. I just wanted to address a lot of questions came in about specifically like what books or movies or things like that. So we will be sending a list of resources after this meeting, and our emails are also listed at the end of these slides, and the slides will go out too. Next slide, please. I really wanted to highlight Surge. A lot of us have worked with Surge, and it's a national organization that has a really active and great local chapter. And for me, since about 2017, it's been my home for this kind of work. And it's a great place for white people who both want to learn and do something. So it's a place to really build skills, relationships, and take action for change. So it's structured that we have accountability partners in the city that are led by people of color, like CASA, Out for Justice, the Campaign for Justice, Safety and Jobs. So it's not just a group of renegade white people. We're really, you know, bound by the community we're in, and really we try to be partners and listen and learn. One of the things I love about Surge is the calling in culture, and the idea that, you know, if you want to do this work, come here, and we're not going to call you out for using the wrong language, because this is a place for us to learn. So it's, I have to say, I really love the culture of Surge. Next paragraph, please, or next slide, please. I also wanted to specifically highlight that there's some resources for raising race-conscious children here. Since you may not get our resources for a little bit, I wanted to encourage you, just after this call, if you're enthusiastic and you want to do something, go to the Surge website. There's lots of ways to get involved. The Facebook page actually will show you about our Monday. Every week, Monday at 7 o'clock, there's a meeting, and you're welcome to come. It's really an open meeting for all people in the community that want to do something and really dismantle racism in Baltimore and around the country. And the cool thing is there are breakout groups. So if there's a topic like talking to your kids about racism that's really alive for you, we can do a breakout. I learned today that Tammy has been leading that. Thank you, Tammy. So that's a great place for you. Next slide, please. For you to get started if you're looking for something. I think maybe keep going. Okay. Oh, this is fading in. Sorry. You can keep going and just put them all on the slide. Thank you. So when I think about how I approach this, I just wanted to share, in case it's helpful, that there's 2 parts of this. And I know we're talking about kids, but really I think it's the same whether there's kids involved or not. We have to start with our own homework, because we can't give something we don't have. It's the, you know, put the oxygen mask on myself first before helping my kid. So really doing your own homework. I'm an introvert. The homework part is easier for me. The reflection and the reading and the podcasts and the movies, there's so much out there, and we're going to send a few resources. But I think doing something with others is so important. And it could be, you know, speaking with our legislators, like we met with Brooke in Annapolis, and now this kind of thing. It could be protesting, but you know, it doesn't need to be something big like that. Just talk to your kids, talk to your family, just start, you know, where you are. So I think doing something internally and externally really creates a virtuous cycle. And I want to remind us that, because I'm very goal oriented, this is not something you're going to get a certificate or a diploma for. This is a lifelong process. I look at it almost like a spiritual journey. Like, it just keeps getting deeper and richer as you go. Next slide, please. You can just put them all in if you don't mind, sorry. So for me, I think setting your intention is probably the most important thing. And if there's nothing else you take out of here, I hope you at least start jotting down what your intention might be. At the end of the day, I want to be able to look in the mirror and know that I did the best I possibly could. So for me, honesty and humility are really important. We have a lot to learn. So being able to listen, learn, talking to your children, of course, is, it seems basic, but a lot of times, you know, we think this is scary for us, so it's going to be scary for them. And that's not necessarily the case. Using questions is great. One of the questions that came in was a person who's married to someone who's a person of color and their children, and, you know, how to work with that. And I honestly think, from my perspective, being married to a person of color, a lot of the work is the same work. It would be interesting. I asked my kids, like, how do you identify? Do you, because they pass as white. So it's interesting just to hear, you know, our kids have picked up so much that we're not aware of. You know, has anyone asked you what you are? You know, just hearing our kids' answers to those kinds of questions, I find very interesting. Of course, talking to your friends and family, some may be allies for you, some may be a more challenging conversation, but that could be your next hard thing, is talking to your friends and family. Find an accountability partner for you. I have to say, not that long ago, I said something which my younger daughter called me out on, because they know that I'm really working on anti-racism, and I would say they're way ahead of me. Like, I'm the slow one in the family. But my daughter, she said, "Mom, that's racist." And I was like, whoa. And of course, defenses came up. But she was right. What I said was racist. And I was so happy that she felt empowered to do that. And I think once we sort of get the ball rolling, it becomes easier, and our kids can feel really empowered, because it's almost like a technology or a gadget. Have you ever handed your kids your phone or some piece of technology and been like, I'm trying to figure this out. Can you help? And they usually can. So yeah, next slide, please.
Sorry, trying. There we go.
How are we doing on time? Okay, great. So I just want to take a minute, because we've spent the last hour talking at you, and there's a lot to absorb, and this is hard stuff, and I'm really appreciative for your participation. And I just want you to stop and think, maybe close your eyes, maybe take a deep breath, maybe reflect on what's resonating for you, what would make sense in your life, in your family. You can jot down on your paper if you want to. You can click the next thing, it will come in. We're offering that if you'd like to share in the chat, you're welcome to, but let's just take a minute, no time pressure, just to really think about what's the next hard thing that you will do, because a lot of folks asked questions about, you know, how to do this or how to start. And I think honestly, the starting is the hardest part. And you take one step and then another step and another step. So what's that next step for you? You don't have to plan 5 years out, but what's something that has maybe been in the back of your mind you need to do? Can you bring it forward? So if anyone would like to share, please feel free to share in the chat. And keep it coming. We have, I think, a few minutes. We tried to answer questions as we went along, but I'm sure that there are more questions, and we invite you to, contact us, come to a Surge meeting, get involved. This is a lifelong journey, and we're excited that you're here, but this is one step, and we hope the conversation continues. Oh, thanks. We have a couple of quotes. But this is really just a beginning, and then I'm going to turn it over to Brooke for questions, answers, and wrapping it up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. You've given us a lot to think about and unpack, and I know I'm sure everybody like me will go back and sort of reflect on all of this and start thinking about how to integrate more of this into our daily parenting and dinner table conversations and driving conversations. I'm impressed you listen to Democracy Now! We're all about story pirates these days. Yeah, so there's one quick question. Can you remind us, are the Monday night Surge meetings on the Facebook page or website? Where do we find them?
Thank you. I meant to include that. If you go to the Surge Facebook page, you'll find the Zoom link for them. So I usually forget until Monday at 6:59, and I just go to the Surge Facebook page.
Great, thanks. There were, I think most of the questions, people wrote in really phenomenal questions, and I think many of them were answered. There were a few questions all around that Beth sort of started talking about, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about it, because I think a lot of people are interested in this. Any thoughts on how much or how deep to go with kids of varying ages? So, and I think that slide got to it a little bit too, which was really helpful. So, the question is, we read a story like Ruby Bridges and it leads to more questions and I don't have a good stopping point. My son is 3. He's been hearing my husband and I discuss protesting police violence. How do I speak to him about what's going on? Then there's a 5-year-old. My 10-year-old asks, why is racism a thing and why is it so bad? There's sort of, you grow, I guess the intricacy of your answers grows as children grow, but maybe you have a little bit that you could talk about. You're on mute.
There I go again. I think that we've talked about this as we've planned tonight, and it's really interesting to me because I think the answer to your question it almost doesn't matter what age the child is, because okay. what we have to remember to do as parents is to listen to them. What is it that they're really asking you? And I think when it comes to topics that sort of rattle us in some way, we kind of quickly shift into almost a reaction that is similar to if somebody our age had asked us that question. And mm-hmm. So that's why I think remembering to pause, count to 5. What is the comment that you just heard? Meet the kid there. Don't meet the kid. Your kid says, I don't want to be white. Don't meet the kid at, that is a racist comment and I don't ever want to think that a child of mine would ever say something like that. No, meet the kid, I don't want to be white. You don't want to be white? Huh. Tell me more about that. You will not believe, and that this tell me more is going to take you, to the teenage years. I can't say it's going to help you all that much with a 15-year-old, but I can't promise you, it probably won't. But I really do think that for the children who are at the sort of 3 to 4, a very verbal 3-year-old will have insights that she or he can share to you. But it's really not typical until the 4 or 5-year-old that you're actually going to hear insights and sort of really deep questions. Mm-hmm. Start right there and don't be afraid. I think that's the big thing.
Right, that's helpful. There was a good question, and I think several of us have kids in public schools, and so we might have a different perspective than folks who are in private schools. but it was about, what's a good way to ensure anti-racist and positive stories about Black and African history can be integrated into our city schools curriculum and at schools. And I don't know if any of you have thoughts about that. I would just say, I think it's important that we speak up to our principals about, issues like that, that it doesn't have to be confined to Black History Month, right? That this is all of our history, this is history that affects everyone. I think if you're involved with the PCAB in Baltimore City Public Schools, when there are forums about, with the superintendent or with your principal, even if they're not about this issue, you can still raise the issue of making sure that that this is part of the pedagogy. So I don't know if other folks have thoughts or ideas on that, but there were a couple questions about, making sure that we're good, that we're speaking up at our schools too.
Liz.
Yeah, schools are hard because they're big institutions. In my experience, I kind of do what I can at home, and what happens at school, we debrief. Right. I think, the structures of racism run so deep in education and in any large institution that it can be hard to push back because, there may be a lack of understanding at the teacher level and at the principal level and at, administrators. I guess the one thing I would offer that I think is really important, there was a really interesting question about diversity at schools. Mm-hmm. And I would just question, when you say diversity, what do you mean? What kind of diversity are you comfortable with? What kind of diversity are you uncomfortable with? And if you're comfortable with sending your child to a school that is, let's say, a third white, a third Black, and a third Latino or Latinx, then why would you not be comfortable sending your child to a school that is 95% Black? And so I guess I question sometimes, what are we talking about when we're talking about diversity? Are we talking about welcoming folks of color into spaces that are white run and white dominated? So there's a lot in this conversation. And I would say, to me, it's I do as much as I can at home. Mm-hmm. I'm really deliberate about the books I read with my kids. Library, when it's not COVID, is a great resource. And again, I personally just kind of debrief what happens at school, but there's definitely better ways to organize parents to push for curricular change.
Right. Thanks. I want to be cognizant of everybody's time because we've run over an hour now. So I think we're going to wrap up. And I'm happy to have, if you all have a final note you'd like to say, I'm happy to give you the space for that now. Any final comments or thoughts you want to share? You guys all good?
I appreciate everybody who showed up, and I look forward to getting into relationships with more folks.
Yeah, I just want to express gratitude too to all of you for taking the time to do this, and for planning it, and for all the work that you do, for coming to Annapolis, for holding your weekly meetings, for just for everything that you do to make us to hold people like me, public officials, accountable, and to help us do better and to push us to be better. I think it feels sometimes like it's not, but racism is not an inevitability. We can change, and we can do better, and we can be better, and it takes personal and collective action to do so. It starts with these tough conversations and taking strong actions to dismantle the structures that continue to oppress people of color and to hold our communities back, or to hold all communities back. And we have to make sure that our kids, the next generation, do better than we've done. It's not inevitable that they will do better, right? We have to be a part of making sure that it's better. Progress is not always linear. So I'm really grateful for all of you and the work that you do, for everybody who's joined us tonight. Thank you. Also, I always like to make sure that I end these with a note of gratitude for all of the frontline workers out there. We're in our homes right now, but I'm really grateful for the farm workers, the transit drivers, the nurses, the doctors, the personnel, the grocery store clerks, like for the work that you're doing and that you've been doing the past 6 months to keep our families fed and to keep our economy moving. So thank you to them and to all of you. And the conversation will continue. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a great night. Thanks. Take care.
You.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.